There once was a young man named David. He was a shepherd who looked after his father's sheep. But God had bigger plans for him. One day, he took his brother's lunch at the battlefield. He heard a giant of a man making fun of God. That man's name was Goliath. Everyone was scared of Goliath, but not David. With only a sling and 5 stones, David met Goliath in the valley between the armies. David had 5 stones, but he only needed 1. He struck Goliath, and the giant fell down dead. The army of Israel rejoiced because God helped a young man named David have victory. Never be afraid of the big, scary things in your life. With God's help, you can do anything.
That little video clip ended by saying, with God's help, you can do anything. That sounds really good. Very pious. Something that we really should believe. But is it true? Is it true even when the giants that you're facing are really, really big and really, really mean and really, really scary and bent on your annihilation? Because read the full story. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 17. And that's the picture you get of Goliath. The real David and Goliath story isn't just about some little guy beating the big guy or some underdog defeating an overwhelming favorite. I mean, even if you've never read the Bible, you hear those kind of David and Goliath analogies, well, pretty much all the time, especially a lot of times in sports. I mean, this year we've even heard our own Padres owner talking about slaying the dragon up the freeway. Another one of those David and Goliath analogies about beating someone who's always beaten us and who's, again, was the overwhelming favorite. But in the real story, again, you're going to find that in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Goliath is big, he's mean, he's nasty, and he wants to rip David limb from limb, and that's not just trash talk. He actually means it. That's what he intends on doing. That's how they fought in those days. And there's no way that David should even be in this fight. I mean, it's not a sporting event here, it's a death match. And David is fighting way out of his weight class. I mean, Goliath is 9 feet tall. And while David's never lined up to be measured, well, he's probably no more than 5.5 feet or so. And Goliath is a trained and experienced killer. David, he's a shepherd boy who came to bring his brother's lunch. Goliath is strong and muscled, and, well, David's still developing. Goliath's flak jacket weighs 150 pounds. David might not have ever even lifted 150 pounds. Getting the picture? And yet, what happens is that David goes to fight Goliath, and David, not Goliath, wins, which is amazing. I mean, and usually when we try to make some connections between David's story and our story, what we do is we end up talking about facing your own giants. Facing your own giants, whatever they are, and defeating them. And there is some real value in that because for most of us, it seems like there's always giants around somewhere. The giants we need to deal with, and giants sometimes like Goliath that seem way bigger than us and seem like, well, they want to destroy us. So what can we learn here, again, 1 Samuel 17, about, well, call it being like Dave? Well, the first lesson I learned from this story about being like Dave is to prepare for the battle before you even know there is one. Prepare for the battle before you even know that there is one. Again, look at the story. And did Dave show up there thinking that he was headed for a fight? No. He was just bringing his brother's lunch, and he expected to go back to shepherding the flock after that. Did David have any soldier training? Nope. I mean, he'd had to defend the flocks from wild animals, so he's not without some fighting skill, but he had no serious training for a fight against an experienced warrior, much less one who's a giant. Did David have any cutting-edge, high-tech technology to overcome his size and experience deficits? Nope. A sling and 5 smooth stones is all that David brought to the fight. And yet David was still prepared for the fight. Prepared for the fight because, see, preparation has to do with heart. And what I'm talking about by heart here is not some natural courage or ability. I'm talking about heart as pursuing your relationship with God. Now, David's just a teenager, but David evidently had spent a lot of time doing that already. I'm getting that by reading between the lines of Acts chapter 16, verse 33. Let me read it to you. God removed Saul and made David their king. God spoke favorably about David. He said, I have found that David, son of Jesse, is a man after my own heart. Meaning that David's seeking me and pursuing me, God's saying here. And because David's been seeking and pursuing God, even as a teenager, David here, he knows God. He not only knows who God is and what God can do, he not only knows that God's with him and trusts that God's with him as he promised to be, David also knows God as a friend. I mean, you get the impression of that by reading some of David's Psalms. And that's why I think that David is so upset here. He's so upset that Goliath's making fun of God. And why David is so upset that no one else is defending God's honor. And why David is so prepared to run into the fight with this giant that he didn't even know was coming, and even though it looks like he's totally overmatched. David was prepared to fight the giant that day because for some time now, David's heart had been what I call syncing up with God's. Just think about that. David's heart had been syncing up with God's. You know, so can yours. So can yours. Your heart can sync up with God's every bit as much as David's did, which is the lesson here, I think. The lesson? Well, work on your heart now, even before the giants show up. Work on your faith now, even before the giants show up. Work on your faith continually, even before the giants show up. I mean, think of it this way. You don't go from lifting 10-pound weights to lifting 100-pound weights or 150-pound weights just like that. You've got to, if you start with the 10-pound weights, you got to spend some time lifting and working out and working up to those bigger weights so your muscles can handle that. And that's the same way it works with faith. The time to develop your faith muscles is before the crisis hits that requires some heavy lifting. So being prepared isn't about seeing everything that could possibly be coming. Again, David didn't know this giant was coming. And well, did any of you know that COVID was coming or see how far-ranging it would be or how long-lasting it would be? You just can't ever anticipate every giant that you're going to be facing. But, and here's the key, if you are continually working on syncing your heart with God, if you're continually working on developing that deeper relationship with Jesus and working out your faith, see, what you're doing is, what you find is when you're suddenly facing giants, well, then you're going to instinctively turn to Jesus first. And that's where your heart automatically goes. And that's who you're going to need if the giant's going to lose. So this is absolutely critical. So before moving on in this conversation, just hit pause. I want you to do some work right now. First, number one, assess where are you currently, what are you currently doing for your faith life, for your faith workouts? Then number 2, write it down. Write it down, or thumb it down in the note field in your phone so that you can simply look at that and see, oh, this is what I'm doing now, not just think about it. Write it down. Then number 3, as you're looking at that, ask yourself, what, if anything, needs to change in your workout? Then again, write it down. Then number 4, just kind of say, well, what's one thing you can do this week to make that change happen? And again, write it down. Write it down. And then, if you really want to be successful, tell somebody else what you've written down. Tell somebody else your plan so they can encourage you. Take a few moments to work through that right now. So you're prepared, or at least as prepared as you can be for giants that you never anticipate coming. You're consistently working on your heart, and your heart is syncing up with God's. But what happens when then the giant suddenly appears, and it's like game on? And then take you into 1 Samuel chapter 17. I'm in verse 23. As he was talking with them, Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. So David's just out there bringing his brother's lunch, talking to his brothers, and then across the valley, it's like the battle lines part, and in the middle of this hill walks out this big, thundering giant. And he shouts defiance, and, well, the next sentence makes it abundantly clear what everyone else did. And this is not the first time they'd seen or heard the giant. Verse 24, whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. But not David. And remember, this is the first time that David's seen Goliath, first time that he's seen this huge, fierce, mean warrior, and he's screaming defiance against God. And David's reaction is totally different. He's not running away and hiding. He goes to the king and he says, I'll take care of this. Verse 32, don't worry about this Philistine, David told him. I'll go fight him. Scrawny teenager versus full-grown man. Somewhere between 5.5 feet tall versus 9 feet. Shepherd boy versus trained soldier, mean, nasty, killing machine, and stones and a sling against the best weapons and armor of the day. And yet, David is willing and ready to go and face that giant rather than running away and hiding like everybody else. And here's why. It's that heart. It's that heart that had been sinking with God. That's a heart that prepared David for something that he never saw coming. And that's a heart that recognized, if I go out there and if I face that giant, I'm not going to do it by myself. Now, nobody else in Israel seemed to realize that from the king on down. They all watched one lone young teenager walk down the hill by himself to face that giant. And I'm sure they were already planning their escape route as they're thinking the fight's going to reach the conclusion they assumed is going to happen because, well, when it's boy versus giant, the giant usually wins. But because his heart was sinking with God's, David saw things differently. David might have walked down that hill all by himself, but David knew that he definitely did not go into that fight alone. Check this out. David says he's going to go fight the giant, and the king says, in effect, boy, you're crazy. Verse 33, don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy. And he's been a man of war since his youth. And David says this, Verse 37. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. The Lord's going to do it. God's going to be with me. I'm not going all alone. And when he's going out to meet Goliath, and Goliath makes fun of him, David again makes reference to the presence and to the power of God. Verse 45 to 47. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with the spear and the sword and the spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." Again, looks like I'm all by myself, but I'm not facing you alone. The Lord is with me. All right, so here's lesson number 2 whenever you find yourself facing giants. Remember, you are not alone. Remember that you are not alone. You're never alone. You're never facing giants all by yourself. God himself is with you. Yeah, the giant may be big. The giant may be really big. But God is always bigger. God's always bigger, and he's with you. And now, when you see that, well, you still might not want to face the giants, but you're ready. You're ready. And check out this next sentence, which I think is totally amazing. All right, so David knows that he's not going alone, that God is with him. His heart's been sinking with God. So here's what happens. Verse 48. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. David doesn't run away. He doesn't pause to reconsider his course of action. David runs into battle. I mean, he's totally outmatched, and he actually runs toward the giant. He actually runs to face him head on, which is the exact opposite of our natural inclination, isn't it? I mean, sometimes, maybe most times, when you see one of those giants, you just want to run and hide, right? Because the giant seems way too big, way too mean, way too nasty, way too much for you. Or if you started saying, no, I'm going to take this giant on because God's with me, then you start to reconsider. Because the closer you get to the giant, the bigger that Goliath becomes. And again, when you see that, well, you get scared, and your inclination is to turn and run away. It seems like a much better option. But that'd be a mistake. Running's a mistake. You see, the only way out of the valley is through the valley. And the only way to slay the giant is to face him head on, which most of the time that's frankly too much for me. But one of the advantages I have of, living for a while and having lived through some stuff is that I've been able to see that, that's actually true, that God is always bigger than the giant. Can't always see it in the moment, but I can see it looking back on the stuff that I lived through, that God has always been bigger than the giant. And like David, while it might appear as if I'm fighting the giant by myself, I've learned that no, the truth is you're never, ever alone in the fight. You're never, ever alone in the fight. God is with you, God is fighting for you, and the battle is the Lord's. All right, so don't be afraid to run into battle and fight that giant. Don't ever quit on your worst day. All right, instead, keep moving, which is what David did. And keep trusting, which is what David did. And use what God gives you to take on the giant, which, again, is what David did. David just picked up 5 smooth stones, which really didn't seem like much, not against a giant. But it was enough. In fact, it was more than enough. David took only one shot. And one shot was all that it took. And that's because while David took the shot, it was God who guided the stone. And the giant was dead. And David, not Goliath, walked out of the valley that day. And David learned something that day that's still true to this day. You feel pretty small when you're fighting a giant, right? But no matter how big the giant is, God is bigger still. And God is with you. God's going to fight for you. And God's going to win in the end. And evil's going to lose big time. Which means that you can go out there and face the giant, even though you're afraid. So when we hear this story of David and Goliath, when we read it, when we maybe dig into it a little bit like we've been doing, we try to make some connections between where we live and what we've read, and we usually wind up in this spot. Be like Dave. Right? Be like Dave. Because, well, Dave was the hero. And we want to be the hero of the story. We want to be the giant killer, the underdog who wins against overwhelming odds, the rookie with absolutely no military experience who's still able to fight and kill Goliath. And so we see the story as telling us, well, be brave. Be brave. Have faith in God. Face the giants of life steadfastly. And you know, it's important for us to do that. But when we only read the story that way, it just kind of makes the story about us, and it makes the moral of the story, try harder. Try harder to be like Dave. Try harder to be like Dave, and then you're going to find the faith and the courage you need to face your fears and to fight your giants. But you know that try harder to be like Dave also leaves us feeling kind of empty some of the times. Maybe a lot of the times. Because it leaves us missing something. And defeated more often than we're victorious. Because, frankly, a lot of times we don't have that kind of faith, do we? And we can't seem to find faith like that, can we? And the giants we're facing, they're just laughing at us. They're laughing at us and making us feel really, really small and defeated. And we're feeling we got no chance to beat them. And we're not charging into battle like Dave. We're more like, well, all of the Israelites up there on the hillside staying on the sidelines. We're scared. We're stuck. We're not daring to fight. And we're letting our giants get the best of us. Been there? Well, me too. But you know, there's another way to read this story than simply be like Dave, try harder. I'd suggest maybe a better way to read the story. A way that makes God the hero of the story, not us. I mean, first of all, there's the stuff that we've already seen. In the story of David and Goliath, we see that God is capable of defeating any and all the giants in our lives. And our only job is to sink our hearts with Him well enough to cling by faith to Him and to His power. Second thing we've seen is that God really does care deeply for his children. And you never go into battle alone. That God is always with you, just like he was with Dave. And then, when you read this story of David and you put it in the context of the overall story of the Bible, you see something else. You see how the story of David actually has some hints here of Jesus. Or as the Jesus Storybook Bible that we give out to young kids at baptism says, every story whispers his name. Every story whispers his name. So instead of just stopping here with, how can I be like Dave? What we're going to do is asking, well, what does Dave show us about Jesus? And how does seeing that help me make it better for me facing my giants? So what does Dave help me see about Jesus? Well, like David, Jesus came to his task of deliverance looking weak, not strong. And like Dave, Jesus stood in the place of the people that he was fighting for, so that his victory became their victory. And like David, Jesus gives his people a victory that they didn't do anything to earn themselves. Here's that theme of grace coming in again. But unlike David, Jesus actually did this not merely at the risk of his life like David, but at the cost of his life. And Jesus delivers us not just from giants that we can see, but from even bigger ones that we can't, like sin and guilt and death and the power of the devil, which are giants that impact not only our life here, but our future and our eternity. And as for our place in the story, well, again, we're a whole lot more like the Israelites standing on the side of the hill, right? Knowing that we can't win this battle, that we can't win this battle on our own. And instinctively, we do know that. And that's why God didn't send the Israelites there an example to emulate, someone to inspire them to overcome their fears. God sent them a deliverer. God sent someone to rescue and deliver them, someone to fight and defeat the enemies that they couldn't. Again, just like Jesus, right? So at the deepest level, when you see all those things, you see that God's the hero of the story. That Jesus is the hero of the story, not us. And it's about what he does, not what we do. And I want you to understand the big difference that makes if we start there. All right? When did the Israelites move to take on the Philistines? When did they do that? You have to read almost all the way to the end of the chapter in 1 Samuel chapter 17 to get there. The Israelites don't move off that hill till way down in verse 52. David went into the valley to face Goliath, and they're still standing there watching from a safe distance. And David defeated Goliath, and they're still up there on the hill standing still. It's not till after they saw David actually defeat Goliath, and that Goliath is dead, that's when they got into the fight. Let me read verse 52 to you. Then, all right, this is after David has killed Goliath. Then the men of Israel and Judah gave a great shout of triumph and rushed the Philistines, chasing them as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. So what helps us face our own giants? It's not be like Dave. It's seeing that Jesus has already won the victory. All right. You see, when we see that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, has defeated sin and guilt and death and the power of the devil, it actually gives us the courage to face our own giants with courage and strength. And it helps us not only get in the fight, but actually win the fight. When we see that Jesus already has. And Jesus, who already has won, is with us, and we get to share in the results. We win because he does. It really does make all the difference. I really like how one of David's Psalms puts it. Psalm 56, verse 3. Even when I'm afraid, still I will trust in you.